Well, hello everybody and welcome to Unit 2. I hope you've had a chance to complete your influencing capabilities profile, because today really is about a debrief on that. So it may not make a lot of sense to you at the moment, but it certainly will by the time we've finished in this hour. I also hope that you've had a chance to practice the feedback that we talked about in session 1. That was the homework, is to attempt to give more feedback, whether it's positive or negative or whatever. And I hope you've had a chance to try that out. And I'd be interested to hear your stories, of course, as to how that might have gone. Just to remind people that if you've got questions throughout the broadcast, the place to register that is over on the right-hand side where it's got questions. Just type your question in the moment you think about it, because if you do that, I'll stop at different points throughout the broadcast and respond to those questions. And that means that we're not leaving them all to the end, because they might very well be relevant at that particular time. So please go ahead and record them as soon as you think of them, because you may forget them and not have them answered. And of course, if we don't answer them all, you've got my email address and I'm more than happy to try to respond to those in between sessions. All right, so I'm just going to turn off the webcam for the moment so that we can, well, more so I can see the screen more than anything else, and we'll get underway. All right, now the first thing I want to do is let you have a look at these 4 famous people. Now, some of them you probably should recognise, and there may well be others that you may not recognise, or there might be some that you say, well, that face is very familiar, but I'm not really sure who they are. So why have I got them there? Well, what do you think they've all got in common? That's the first question that I've got for you. What do you think that each of those particular individuals have in common? I think, as I've said up there in the topic, they are all leaders. It's true, 3 of them are dead and 1's still alive. You might want to work out who that is. But the answer to that question about what they've all got in common is that they're all, or have all been, highly influential. Kate mentions here that they all lead change. Absolutely correct, Kate. All of those people have been highly influential during their careers. They have changed perceptions incredibly. Now, when you look at some of those people, you're going to actually either warm to them or not. These people have also been very, very divisive. There are people that either love them or hate them, and it'll be true for you as well. So I'm not putting these people up as exemplars of great people per se, but rather that they've been highly influential, highly influential. So starting on the left-hand side, we have former Vice President and climate change activist Al Gore. We have first British female Prime Minister who was in power for 10 years, Margaret Thatcher. We have Martin Luther King, the civil rights activist of the 1960s. And we have Mother Teresa, who has recently been elevated to sainthood as the person who has looked after the homeless people of Calcutta and all over the world, and given her life to that cause. All of them have been highly influential, and I guess that's my main point about that. I'm going to use these people to talk about the influencing capabilities profile as we go through, because it's a good opportunity for you to have a look. And those of you who have done the electronic copy, you can actually click on a link and actually see them in operating, and you can actually see their style or their influencing capability very clearly. The other thing that they've all got in common is that they all have used a particular style or strategy to influence, and that's why I've used them here, because they have very much unique styles. and very pertinent to the influencing capabilities profile. Now, the first thing I probably need to do before we go any further is say, well, what do I mean by influence? Because sometimes it's a dirty word. People naturally think about influence and manipulation and all sorts of things. So let's be really clear about what I mean by influence, because that's critically important in this whole process. To me, influence is the power to make other people agree with your opinions or get them to do what you want willingly and ethically. And those two words at the end are very important. Influence is power, and we're all trading in power every day if you think about it. Really, and we're all in the business of influencing, I might also say, but my definition is it's about getting people to do things because they want to do it, and also being able to get people to do things not in any underhanded way, but rather in a transparent way. So let's be absolutely clear about that up front, rather than be working on some illusion that it's about manipulation or deception. It's not. It's neither of those things. I also want to make the point very clearly to all of us in this broadcast, and it's very, very true, that all of us, I don't care who you are, all of us are actually in the business of influence. Every day, whether it's on the home front or on the work front, or with it's the people that you lead, whoever it might be, we're in the business of influence, all of us, and it's important to understand that. I would also say to you that influence is the lifeblood of leaders. So top leaders are people who are highly influential, and they practice and work at being influential, both ethically and transparently, of course. So let's be clear about that, and that's one of the reasons that this is a unit in this particular Lunch and Learn program, because it is a very important attribute, and we could all be better at it, no doubt. So whether you're a salesperson, whether you are in the whatever industry you're in, whether you're in the not-for-profits, whether in the private sector, public sector, and we've got all of those people. We've got people in this broadcast all over the world from all different cultures. But at the end of the day, we're all in the business of influence. So it's important we get that clear to start with. Now, if you actually think about it, and this is before we get looking at your profile, but if you actually think about it, there are 3 variables involved in any influencing situation or in any circumstance where you're influential. One of those variables is your own preferred style and approach. Now, each of us have got a preferred style and approach. That's the reality. And what the influencing capabilities profile that I put together was attempting to do was to give you an indication of what your preferred style and approach is. And incidentally, I put together that influencing capabilities profile and also the book, the New Influencing Toolkit. I wrote the book and put that questionnaire together because I was frustrated that out there in the marketplace, the material that was on influence was either too academic and it couldn't be used. So it was just kind of very esoteric and it really wasn't applicable to our everyday needs. Or at the other end of the continuum, I found some of the work was too salesy, and it was really, the context was really around selling. And I felt that really there needed to be something in the middle, and that's why I designed the influencing capabilities profile. But nevertheless, your style and approach is absolutely an important indicator, because the reason I say that is that you will tend to influence people how you like to be influenced yourself. So for example, if you're somebody who likes to be influenced by logical, rational, facts and figures, that is entirely how you will influence other people. The only problem with that, of course, is that other people who you might be in the business of influencing may not have that preferred style or approach. In other words, they want to be influenced in another way, and that can always be an issue. So the other variable is the other person's style and approach. Now obviously we've all had cases where we've been banging on about something and we're just not getting through to someone. In fact, the glaze goes in their eyes. I know I'm sure we've all been there. And what we do is we keep banging on using our own particular style and approach, and we find we're getting nowhere. And we just try harder and harder to be more of what we are. In other words, our own personal style. It doesn't work. What we've got to do, of course, is change our style and change our approach. Why? So that we can match the other person's style and approach. And of course, the third variable in all of this is the context. Certain situations require different forms of influence. There are some circumstances, for example, where tugging at the heartstrings is appropriate, and there are other circumstances where fact, figure, and logic is appropriate. There are some circumstances where it's appropriate for you to push, and there are other circumstances where it's appropriate for you to pull. In other words, take people with you. So we'll be exploring all of that during this Lunch and Learn session. I've just got a question here which I will respond to right away. They all lead change. Oh, someone's just mentioned that they've lost sound. I hope that's not everyone. If you do, if it's still clear, if I'm still clear, then could you perhaps just indicate that to me? Otherwise I'm talking to myself, which is not good. All good here. Okay, thank you. I can hear you fine. Great, excellent, still on, still clear, wonderful. Okay, moving right along. Now, you've seen this framework, whether you did the paper or pencil or the electronic version, and this is in fact the influencing capabilities framework that I put together. It's a very simple 2x2 matrix. There's plenty of those models out there, of course, but let me just unpack it a little bit, and while I'm doing that you might like to have a look at your scores in the relevant areas. So if you look at the top, you'll notice that there is two styles, push and pull. Now let me unpack that a little bit. If you look at the difference between the push and pull style, you'll notice that on the left hand side, people who like to push like to drive, they're making proposals, giving information. Obviously in my approach now it's very much a push style because this is the nature of the webinar that we're in. I'm conveying information, I'm basically taking an idea and giving it to you and presenting it to you, and of course in an influencing context this is exactly the right way it should be in this kind of learning environment. On the other hand though, we have the pull style where this is people who like to enable others, drag people with them, test understanding, seek out information, do more listening than talking, building up, opening up, getting other people to come to the idea. Now what's interesting about this from your point of view is if you actually add up, if you haven't already done it, of course electronically this had already been done for you, but if you actually look at your investigation and your motivation scores, which of course fall in the push style, and you add them up, you'll get a collective score for your push style at the top. Again, if you add up your calculation and your collaboration score, you'll get a collective result for your pull style. Now what's interesting about that is your push style dramatically higher, or is your pull style dramatically higher, or are they pretty much the same? Now if they're pretty much the same, then obviously you're fairly versatile, and you can kind of understand that you need to be versatile in different situations. But if you've got a strong push style or a strong pull style, it probably indicates that you may be using that style too much, and there might be circumstances where you might want to consider using the other style. So that's the first dimension that's important in my model. You'll also notice that over on the left-hand side you've got a logical and emotional approach. Now what do I mean by a logical and emotional approach? Well, you can see there I've given you a little chart to help you plot your way through that. People who are very logical like to deal in facts and evidence and being rational and structured and having measurement. All right, now I dare say many of you who are in this broadcast are exactly like that. How will you know? Well, if you add up your investigation and your calculation scores, and you add up your motivation and your collaboration scores, you will get an indication of whether you favour a logical or emotional approach when you're influencing other people. All right, and of course the emotional approach is more around feelings, perceptions, values, flexibility, maintaining morale and so forth. Now, most of our workplaces are geared towards the logical approach. You know, we have systems and processes, and we have safety requirements, we have regulatory requirements, and that's how most of our workplaces are set up. And you can understand why that's the case. However, it would be a big mistake to assume, particularly if you've got a high score in logic, it would be a big mistake to assume that everybody else around you favours the logical approach. You will find, surprisingly, that a lot of people are influenced by emotion. And of course, the advertising industry have known that for a long time. And that's precisely what they're attempting to do. So you've got push, pull, logic, emotion, and that's an interesting split. And what that's ended up with is 4 particular strategies for influence. You've got investigation, which is a push logical style and approach. You've got calculation, which is a pull logical style and approach. You've got collaboration, which is a pull emotional style and approach. And you've got motivation, which is a pull emotional style and approach. So I'll unpack these obviously a little bit more for you, and so you've got a better understanding of what they mean. But essentially what's happened when you completed your profile is it gives you a score around those 4. And it's interesting to do a bit of a comparative analysis and see how closely aligned each of those 4 scores are. But if one score is clearly dominant, then you're probably using that to great effect in certain circumstances, and probably in other circumstances it's not working at all. So you need to change your strategy, and we'll talk a bit more about that as well. Okay, moving right along. Now, those of you who have done the electronic copy, this will be familiar with you. Those of you who've done the paper and pencil would realise that each of these 4 strategies have 4 underpinning capabilities, and the electronic one gives you a percentage, whereas the paper and pencil one will give you a score. But nevertheless, either way, you will see that you will have some scores that are higher, some scores that are lower on each of the 16 influencing capabilities. And I think this is a very important slide, because what it shows you is where you need to put your efforts in as a leader. So where you have clearly a low score, and you might say, well, what's a low score? Well, a low score is relative. So we're talking about a low score relative to the other capabilities, okay? So the example that you've got in what you can see on my screen here, the low scores relative would be here, offering concessions. So they've got 33% there. So my advice to that person would be that they need to find opportunities where they can offer concessions, because that is an influencing capability that's not being harnessed or utilised to the best of its ability. On the other hand, this person, of course, has a very high score in gathering evidence. So they like gathering evidence, and that's important to them when they're putting a case. And the important point for this person, if I was giving them some coaching, would be simply this: don't overdo it. Don't, not everything requires gathering evidence and information. Sometimes it might be best just to have a spontaneous conversation. So just be careful with that. So the important thing is have a look at your scores and determine where you need to do a little bit of work. Put a circle around them and decide that you're going to do some work to try and build up that capability. And ultimately what you're attempting to do, and if you look at this person here, you can see that they have 74% for investigation, 65 for calculation, 53 for motivation, and 54 for collaboration. So clearly they favour a logical approach, and their style is marginally a push style, which basically means that they can be typecast as an investigator, or they prefer to use the investigation strategy when they're trying to influence other people. So you see how that works? So you just have to go back to your profile and have a look at your scores and see how that all unfolds. Keep the questions coming in, folks, because I'm throwing a lot of information out there, and it's really important that you ask me questions. It's all about your learning experience. So I've got a question here from Rebecca. How can we convert the raw numbers on the paper version to percentages? No need to do that, Rebecca. I know most of you have done the paper version, and that's fine. It's really just looking at the relative scores. The electronic version will just do that for you, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter whether it's percentages. What is important is what the relative low scores are and what the relative high scores are. The other thing you might like to do, Rebecca, or anybody else for that matter, is if you've done this, why not go and get someone else that knows you really well, that you might work with, who is prepared to give you honest feedback, and get them to fill it out for you. That could be interesting. In other words, they're looking at it from the point of view of how you influence them, bearing in mind that sometimes we're quite different at home as we are at work, and it might be good to use this in a work context, and it could be a lot of fun just to actually have a look and see what other people think. So more than happy for you to do that if you feel that that's going to give you more insight into how other people see you. All right, moving right along, let's start now talking about these particular individual styles and strategies and how they might impact on what you do. Now, people who like to investigate, and Al Gore is one of those people, and if you've ever seen that Inconvenient Truth video on YouTube, and unfortunately the bandwidth on webinars doesn't really allow me to show you a clip, but by all means go into YouTube and have a look at Al Gore in that Inconvenient Truth video, and you'll notice that it's just absolutely chock-a-block full of facts, figures, charts, graphs, statistics, you name it, because what he's trying to do is influence you and me about the need to do something about climate change, or he was then at least. And he's using facts and figures. He's using what we call the investigator strategy. So they like facts and figures to make their argument. They pursue logic, and they tend to be quite methodical, and they tend to be quite structured. They're often devastating debaters, as Al Gore in fact was when he was in the White House. He was a really good debater. He was the one who was a very process-driven operator, and as we all know, the president at the time was Bill Clinton, who was a very blue sky thinker, and Al Gore was very much the detailed, methodical, fact and figure and logic. So they actually were a good foil for each other. Let's take that a little step further. Now, these little icons that we have here are really useful because it kind of, when you see the icon, you can sort of remember what. So we've got Sherlock Holmes here as a silhouette, and think about Sherlock Holmes and how he influences, obviously, through his investigation, his inquisitive investigator strategy. So in the world of work, police, scientists and researchers are very clearly, their whole profession is designed around collecting evidence and presenting it in such a way to influence outcomes. Police do that. They put a case together. Of course, scientists and researchers do exactly the same thing. They're trying to convince us of a particular hypothesis by using some sort of research to demonstrate that. So when would you use this? As a leader, you use this approach when you're investigating workplace incidents such as a safety or a harassment incident. You want to go and do your homework and get that right. You can't just go on a whim. You need to get your facts and figures, and you need to marshal your, and sometimes you've got to write a report. And so that would be definitely a case where you'd use the inquisitive investigator strategy. On the other hand, large-scale change initiatives where you want people on board aren't always effective because people are being too logical. You actually need to take people with you. You need to find people where you need to determine where people are at, and you need to take people with you as a result of that. So that's the investigator. So how was your score on that? Was it high? Was it low? Where does it fit, and should you be doing more of it, or could you perhaps be doing less of it? So now let's talk about the clear calculator. I couldn't actually think of another word, but calculator, we had to have them sort of ending in OR because I needed to keep it nice and neat around the grid. But I guess the word calculator sounds a little bit manipulative, but it's not necessarily the case. So what do calculators do? Well, calculators like to promote the pros and cons of a proposal. So what they do is they will promote the positives about a particular course of action, and they'll also talk about the negatives of not changing. Now, the best example I can give you is I walked past Harvey Norman's, which is a large retail outlet here in Australia. I walked past Harvey Norman's store the other day, and it had a sign on the door saying, laptops 50% off. Well, that got my attention, as you can imagine, and it gets your attention too. So I decided to go into the store. I walked over to the computer section, and in the computer section there was another sign that said, must purchase by close of business today to reap the 50% benefit. So in other words, the retail outlet was using the classic calculator strategy to influence me. So on the one hand, they were talking about a great benefit of purchasing today, but on the other hand, they were telling me some great difficulty if I didn't purchase today. And this is what calculators do. Margaret Thatcher was a particularly good exponent of this. In fact, people either loved or hated Margaret Thatcher, still do. People were dancing on her grave, literally, when she passed away. But irrespective of what you might think about her as a person, the reality is she was very effective at being able to sell a case, and also she was very effective at being able to talk about the consequences of not following a particular course of action. So have a look at your score, and if you've got so how does this work in practice? Well, if you're giving a presentation to, let's say, a person or a group of people, try and sum up by saying, now, just before we move on, here are the advantages of what I'm proposing for you, 1, 2, 3, and here are the disadvantages if we don't go down this road. And that becomes compelling in the eye of the person receiving that particular proposal. So salespeople, as I've mentioned, are particularly skilled at this. So they'll tend to talk up the positives of something, and they'll tend to talk about the negatives if you don't purchase something. So salespeople have learnt to talk pros and cons. Financial advisors, of course, are in the business of selling you some particular financial asset or advantage, and they'll often talk about, this is the best deal we've got, and frankly, if you don't jump on board now, you may well miss out, because they want you to take action immediately. They're trying to influence you to do that. But animal trainers as well. I love taking my youngest daughter every year to the circus. It's one of the last remaining live entertainment pieces there are around, and we love it. And we love the smells, we love the sounds, we love the whole deal. My daughter particularly likes the ponies, the show ponies, and when the show ponies come on, there's normally a glamorous trainer there who has a whip in one hand and in the other hand a bag full of treats, and uses those depending on how the ponies are performing. So animal trainers use very much reward and punishment to influence the particular animals. And teachers do this as well. If you think about a great teacher that you had at school, I'll guarantee one thing they had the capacity to do was to explain to you where the line in the sand was. And if you crossed that line, there were consequences. Very, very good at that. So people who are skilled at this, well, where it can be used, of course, is where there's new change in the workplace that'll affect people. And so, for example, if you were introducing a new computer system, or you were implementing harassment and bullying legislation training, or you were introducing something new, it would be a good idea for you to invest some time talking about the pros and cons of that. In other words, talk up the advantages of the new system and talk up the advantages in terms of how it affects the individual, but also talk about the disadvantages of staying where you are. In other words, if you don't change, what are the consequences? But if a direction is vague, such, you've got an unclear direction that a business might be taking or whatever, there's no point in talking pros and cons if people don't understand that, they need some clarity around where the direction, where you're taking the business or what are you attempting to do. They want some clarity initially, which is very important. Folks, keep the questions coming in because I'm more than happy to stop at different points and answer those as we go. So we've now looked, if you think about it, at the two logical approaches, investigation and calculation. These two things have logic and rationality in common. So now, let's now talk about what I might call below the line. So on the influencing capabilities model, the two below the line are motivation and collaboration. So let's talk about motivation for a moment. So motivation. People who are very good at motivating are usually people who will talk big picture. So what they're good at is talking or painting a picture or a vision. Richard Branson comes to mind. Martin Luther King comes to mind. If you haven't seen it, I strongly recommend you go to YouTube and type in "I Have a Dream," which arguably is Dr. Martin Luther King's most influential speech, and have a listen. There's not much logic in it whatsoever, but there's a lot of metaphor, a lot of beautiful phrases and words, and he did move a nation with that speech in the late 60s. In fact, arguably, he made a significant difference in terms of the way people were treated in the United States. A very compelling speech. Now, don't think for a minute that you've got to be a great orator to be a great motivator. People telling stories is very, very useful. So, if you're a good storyteller, tell a story. Tell a story particularly about yourself when you got it wrong. That can be a hugely powerful influencer because people love stories and people will relate to stories. And if we had a little bit more time, I could tell you a bit of a story there as well that might be useful. So using words and metaphors and cliches, Martin Luther King was really very, very good at that. And of course, as I said, others are entrepreneurs particularly. So Let's talk about the different personalities out there, or the different sort of occupations that would use motivation. Entrepreneurs. Most great entrepreneurs are very good at painting a vision. And as I mentioned, Richard Branson's a very good example of that. But he's not the only one. Elon Musk, if you get a chance to read his biography, I would strongly, biography, if you read that, it's really gives you a very good insight into his ability to create a compelling vision of the future. He was the one who started out putting together PayPal, and of course he's progressed since then, but always looking at gaps in the marketplace and trying to fill those gaps. Advertising executives, of course, have only got a split second of your time, and what they're trying to do is to paint some sort of a compelling vision for you. PR agents, artistic directors, all of these people have to keep coming back to the big picture. It's critically important to keep everybody on track. So when would you use this? Well, you certainly use it when you've got a new strategic direction and you require the hearts and minds of people. And, you know, some of your organisations and businesses, particularly if you're in the not-for-profit area, you've got a bit of an advantage, because what you can do is you can paint a very clear vision about what this business or organisation is attempting to do. What need is it trying to fulfill? And you can do that very effectively if it's a not-for-profit. But sometimes it's more difficult if, for example, it's in the public sector. But nevertheless, there's always an end user who is benefiting somehow from something. So any sort of strategic direction, a good vision statement, for example, is one that tugs on the heartstrings. It's not one that happens to be logical or factual. But certainly if people are unclear of the rationale or the reason why you're doing something, for example, if all of a sudden you're cutting costs in your area, your team or your division or your organisation, there's no point in you tugging on the heartstrings. People want to understand the facts behind it. They want to understand the rationale. So obviously you've got to use investigation first and foremost before you start to use motivation in that case. So how was your percentage with that? If it was low relative to the others, perhaps you need to work in that area. And in particular, have a look at the 4 underpinning capabilities. Which of those is particularly low and what could you do about it? Okay, moving right along. The last of the 4, and then what we'll do is look at some very practical things that you can do in order to exercise these 4 influencing capabilities. Okay, collaborators. Collaborators are people who like to influence by taking people with them. So they'll use emotion. The difference between the calculators and the motivators is that the calculators will build the team, whereas the motivators will build the vision. So calculators are very good at building teams. They're very good at bringing a team together and pushing them in a particular direction towards a goal, which requires a lot of work. And if you're not a natural calculator, you'll find that difficult to do. But all of us would concede that it's a good skill to have. Mother Teresa was outstanding at this. She worked with minimal resources initially when she was working on the streets of Calcutta, but she was able to marshal enormous resources by working with and through many, many stakeholders, government agencies, NGOs and so forth, in order to marshal resources. She brought people together who were volunteers, who weren't getting paid, so she really had no choice but to be highly collaborative in her influencing style, and she was very, very effective, of course, at that. So let's have a look at a couple of the professions that require the collaborative strategy. Keep the questions coming in, folks, if you've got something that you'd like to ask, or even just to make a statement, which I'm more than happy to read out as well. So, a conductor of an orchestra. I do a fair bit of work with orchestras, and it's fascinating work. I know nothing about music. In fact, I was told at least I was tone deaf at school. Not sure I believe that, but nevertheless, that was the feedback I got. But nevertheless, if you think about conductors don't play a musical instrument. All they have is a baton, and sometimes they don't even use that. Some conductors don't have anything. They just use their hands. So they don't have a musical instrument, yet they are enormously influential because they have a lot to do with the quality of the ensemble in an orchestra. And it is extremely powerful. A good conductor can be extremely powerful. Funeral directors, they've got all these resources they've got to bring together. They've got all these things they've got to marshal. A lot of people don't want to be there, so they've got to bring them all together. They've got to be highly collaborative. And choreographers, dealing with all sorts of actors and people who have huge egos, and they've got to work with all these people in a collaborative way. It requires enormous energy and requires an enormous amount of investment in people. So collaborators, they're some of the professions. Now, if you think about it, in circumstances where there is very strongly held views, I strongly recommend you use collaboration. So, for example, if your team is divided and you have strong views one way and the other, why don't you bring them all together, set some ground rules, and let people speak with respect? In other words, you set the ground rules around, making sure people are heard, not interrupted, and so forth, and you get out on the table these strongly held views. Why? Well, if you don't, they go underground. And what happens, of course, is you have a real problem with getting people to follow through. The views are entrenched, so you're better off talking about them. But look, there's no point in doing that, as my point on the slide is. There's no point doing that if you need to know the logic behind a decision. So if people need to know why we've all of a sudden introduced this customer relationship system in our workplace, they want to know the details. They don't want to, it's no good you sitting there and saying, how are we going to make this work? They actually want to know, why is it there in the first place? So, and once they know, then of course you can sit down and talk to them about how you'll make it work. So using the wrong strategy at the wrong time will not get you the results that you might want. So we have a question here, and thank you. I'll read this out. Oh, look, we've got a few. Good. Wow, quite a few. How can we convert? Okay, we've got that one. Thank you. Tim, I'm just interested in knowing if there is any natural synergies between influencing styles. For example, collaborators and investigators working well together. Great question, Kate, again, thank you. Look, the truth of the matter is, if you look at your model, you look at your scores on your influencing capabilities profile, and you look diagonally opposite. In other words, if you're an investigator, look down and across at collaborators, and if you're a calculator, look down and across at motivators. That is where you'll probably find the greatest source of frustration, because they're opposites, but also the greatest source of inspiration. So if you're an investigator, you probably need to surround yourself with people who like to collaborate. Likewise, if you're a collaborator, you probably need people who are quite logical, rational, and so forth. If you're a calculator, you probably need people who are talking about the big picture. So the argument is, Kate, that you should be aligning yourself with people that don't think like you, which will frustrate the living daylights out of you to start with. But quite frankly, for a team to be at its optimal, you need to work with people who don't necessarily think like you. So that's what I would suggest. I think that's what you were getting at with your question. Tim, that's very funny. My scores were even across the diagonals or even across those. Well, great. That just means that you confuse people at times. Look, it's good. It's all good. In fact, the closer your scores are, the better, because what it means is that you're willing to be flexible and you're probably likely to be flexible, so it's no drama. Good on you. So don't worry about it. It just means it's going to be easier for you to make the necessary changes. My suggestion is you go and look at the 16 capabilities and start to work with some of those. Anyway, let's move on. We need to continue. We've got about 10 minutes before we finish up. Now, just a quick plug. Those of you who have not done the electronic version, you are more than welcome to do that for a nominal fee of $75. If you send me an email, I'm more than happy to link it up. I'll just send you a link and you can do it. And it produces a very nice 14-page report. And in that 14-page report, you get all sorts of interesting information. So for $75, more than happy, but you just have to send me an email and then I'll send you a link, okay? There ends the advertisement. Okay. Now, let's talk about some practical things you can do as a leader. Now, if you're if you want to improve your investigation approach, and in my book, The New Influencing Toolkit, I've got about 65 of these, so I obviously can only go through a few here, but use third-party endorsements. Third-party endorsements are brilliant. So if you know that there's somebody reputable in your industry, somebody in another department has done something that you want to do, then use them by quoting them or even bringing them to your meeting. Highly influential, because they are also people of influence because they've been there and done that. That, of course, is what authors do, or publishers, I should say. When you look on the back cover of a book, you've usually got some reputable person saying, this is a brilliant read, please go out and buy the book, or keep reading because it's a great read. So third-party endorsements work. Use structured interviews in the workplace. If you ask a group of people the same set of questions, this is precisely what we do when we interview, and I know we've got some recruiters in our broadcast today, and this is what recruiters do. They will tend to ask the same questions of different people. Why are they doing that? Because they want to be able to compare, hopefully, apples with apples. It gives them a better chance of being able to do that. And of course, when you're producing a report, it adds greater influence because we know that you have used a similar structure for all interviews. Any surveys that are conducted that are reputable do carry weight, and the reason they carry weight is because there's a methodology behind it that's usually based on an investigative strategy. And as you can see on your page there, you've got process maps. Process maps are great. Go in and have a look at your processes, the way you do things. Map out the process. How does it happen from start to finish? What happens? And then get your team involved and say, guys, where are the roadblocks? Where are the problems? Where are the opportunities? And you know what? You are actually using a number of different particular strategies. You are using collaboration because you're bringing a team together, and you're using investigation because you're using a process, and you could also be using motivation because you could be talking big picture and saying we need to improve the way we do things around here. So that can be very effective, but it's sort of gone out of vogue these days for some reason, but that certainly is worthwhile looking at. Calculation. What could you do? Well, Kurt Lewin was famous for drawing a line down the centre of the page. He was the person who designed the pros and cons type, you know, the system where on the left-hand side you write down all the pros for making a decision, and on the right-hand side you write down all the cons. So which outweighs which? Do the pros outweigh the cons? In other words, do the benefits outweigh the liabilities? And if so, we go ahead. But then again, if the liabilities outweigh the pros, then perhaps we better rethink. Again, you can use this with your team, and you could use a collaborative approach and also brainstorm around what the pros and cons are. Most people who are in the financial services industry will use cost-benefit analyses. So they'll say, here are all the costs and here are all the benefits, and if the benefits clearly outweigh the costs, then it's a good idea. Let's move on. Let's do it. After action reviews, after the end of something, what went well, what didn't go well, and what will we do differently as a result of what we learnt, can be a fantastic influencing tool, and the military use this quite extensively, of course. I think we don't use this anywhere near enough in the corporate world. We should do so. So there's 3 tools. If you have a low score in calculation, you might like to try those. Let's move on to motivation. Team values chart. Remember, motivation is below the line. It's about influencing people by emotion. In particular, what we're trying to do is get people linked to the big vision. So what about a team values charter? 4 great questions. What's one value that you believe is important working in this team? Question 2, define it. Question 3, why is it important to you? Question 4, what behaviours would demonstrate this around this table? Get everyone to do that. Get them to buy into a charter. Very powerful. Works extremely well. That, of course, is an emotional influencing tactic. The GROW model, don't have enough time to get in that in huge detail, but that GROW stands for goal, reality, options, where to from here. Great process of getting people to think for themselves. Tell people a story. And why not start? I'm fascinated why people don't do this more often. Why don't you start your meetings? And of course, Unit 6 is all about meetings, and I'll be banging on about this a bit more, but why don't you just start your meetings with a good news story? Go around the room and say, win for the week. Just get everyone to talk about something that went well. It works really well. I mean, you're going to talk about all the negatives, you might as well talk about all the positives. Why not do that? Now, for those of you who may be struggling with collaboration, what can you do? Well, begin with the end in mind, as Stephen Covey said in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Get people together and say, look, we've got an hour or we've got 20 minutes. We're going to talk about this topic. I want to see if we can come to some resolution. I don't care how we get there, but the rule of thumb is we want to walk out of here and be on the same page. So I'm starting with a clear understanding of where we're going, and then I'll just let people go. Give people feedback. Well, guess what? Unit 1 was all about that. Again, if you think about it, where does that fit in? That's a collaborative strategy, because feedback is something where we're getting feedback from them as well as giving feedback as well. Keep the questions coming in, folks. We've still got about 5 minutes, and I'll try and finish right on time. Use problem-solving approaches, getting people involved, investigate and use problems, but do it in a collaborative way. When you paraphrase and you say to someone, in other words, your concern about this is blah, 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 you're actually using a collaborative tool. In other words, you're actually validating what the person said, you're letting them know you've listened to them, and you've also can move the conversation on. That can be extremely powerful. Okay, we've got another question here. Let me just respond to that. Here we go. Do you believe that earning respect is a large part of influencing people? Absolutely, Paul. Absolutely. Respect is where it's at. In fact, all of these tools don't work very well if you're not respected. So respect underpins everything. Yeah, you can actually also win respect by using these tools in the right place at the right time with the right people. So absolutely, yes. I mean, if people absolutely, if they don't trust you, it doesn't matter what you do, frankly, it's not going to work. So trust is where you start, or respect is where you start first. So thanks, Paul. That's an underpinning of all of this. Okay, we're at the end, guys. Now, every time we do one of these things, I give you homework. Why? because whilst you might have found this very entertaining, very much fun, very insightful, blah, 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 if you don't do anything differently, guess what? Nothing changes. So this Lunch and Learn series that you've bought into is all about applying what you've learned. So what do I want you to do between now and next time we meet? I want you to, if you haven't already, and I know there's some of you in this broadcast that haven't done it, I want you to complete your profile. Those of you interested in doing it electronically, you can send me an email, but just do it. If you've done it, guess what? I want you to implement one of the tools that you've learned. I want you to go out and consciously make an effort this afternoon. If you are in Australia, if you're other parts of the world, tomorrow morning or whatever time it is, I want you to go and try to influence people in a way that is not natural for you to do, and see what happens. Have some fun with this. If plan A doesn't work, try plan B, C and D. And what I might do is just end on this note and just say to you this. Let's say, for example, you've got a team meeting tomorrow. Let's say, for example, that or you've got a presentation to make. So you've got a whole bunch of people in a room. So how could you do that in a way that's more influential? Well, here's a thought. You want to create a very logical, coherent argument. So you're going to have perhaps at the beginning a little bit of an agenda about some of the things that you're going to cover in your presentation. So put that out there. Why? Because that's the investigative approach. Let people know that there's a methodology and a rationality about what you're doing. So put it out there. Then, by all means, link what you're proposing with the big picture in the organisation. So how does this fit in with the strategic direction of the organisation? That's using motivation. Ask people to comment and make comment about, in other words, involve people in your meeting or in your presentation. That's involving collaboration. And last thing, perhaps if you're using a slide, put up a slide and on one side talk up the advantages of your proposal for them personally, and on the other hand, on the other part of the slide, put some disadvantages of not moving in the direction that you would like people to go. And you will be enormously influential because you're hitting on all four strategies, and you can be assured that in the people in the room, the larger the audience, the more likely all four strategies will be represented in the room, and of course you'll be far more influential. So no more questions by the look of it. So thanks guys. I've really enjoyed working with you. I hope you found it useful. Get out there, keep the feedback going, and this is all accumulative, and keep building now on influencing. And you've noticed on the screen there, we've done 2 of the 6 modules. So we will be meeting again, of course, in April, and we'll be looking at optimizing team performance at that stage. So keep up the good work, and by all means, I'm always interested in feedback, so send me an email, talk to me via email. I'm more than happy to do that. So thanks folks, all the very best, and I wish you the best. Thanks Gary for your feedback there at the end. I appreciate that, and we'll finish up right there.